face, staring at the swaying trees, and just tired in good ways. In 1 week, it was entirely fucking possible that we'd lose that one sacred connection that had bound us for so long. At least where we lost, we gained.
Bella's point of view. Failure. It was a word that seemed to dictate my every habit nowadays. I feared it, hid from it, eluded it at every possible turn, terrified that I'd lose all this forward momentum. My thoughts raced as he rested his cheek on my stomach, his knees bent at my hips, my legs still wrapped around him and my fingers running through his hair. It was soft and slightly dampened at the roots, his eyes staring out over the trees. He'd occasionally hum as my fingers caressed his messy locks, sometimes shivering. Even though he insisted that he was anything but cold. I locked my feet around him, and we lay perfectly still, his hands flattened to the sides of my breasts, and sporadically stroking my skin. It was like I was waiting for something to happen. Maybe the sky would open up and unleash a bolt of lightning. Or my heart would palpitate, or Edward would get one of those really mortifying leg cramps, or something. But nothing happened. This wasn't a failure. It was almost too surreal to even consider. Sure, I may have been hyping it up in my head, thinking through all the various ways in which I would ruin it, but who could blame me? I'd been convinced after I set that date, that there'd be no way. Likely as me or Carlisle would choose to be all annoyingly parental that day, or I'd start my period, or something would happen between then and now to render one of us physically incapable. Even as I'd been indulging my weird Chinese cuisine kick, my worries had wormed their way into the previous night's atmosphere, and had created a contrary recipe of fated failure fortune cookies. I hadn't been able to shake it. I just wasn't used to things going right. Hell, I'd resigned myself to a cautionary life of abstinence for Chris' sake. I'd convinced myself that sex really wasn't all that great anyway. God, was I wrong? It was like losing my virginity all over again without all the pain, and crying and humiliation. It was nothing like the other times. It was sweet and slow and tender, and yet still, completely freaking hot. And I knew that Edward figured it was only him, but I couldn't wait to rub this in Jasper's face. Edward suddenly sighed, shifting his head slightly to meet my gaze. Enough time had passed for the sun to move almost completely behind the trees, and it illuminated his copper hair with a pale, orange glow. My legs were getting stiff from lying in this position, but it was still comfortable, so I said nothing. His reddened lips were set into a thin line, his green eyes searching mine as I worked a brow quizzically.
Next week,
he began, his tongue darting out to wet his lips, as his eyelids dropped. He turned his face, pressing a kiss to my stomach, below my belly button. I interjected before he could continue, "It's just experimental, one night is nothing." 7 hours. "We've gone longer," I assured, only vaguely realizing my subtle dig at his leaving me, when his hands pressed firmly into my skin, eyes darkening as his chin poked into my stomach. Voice heavy with remorse, I apologized, "I'm sorry. I wasn't meaning it like that," and he nodded, though his gaze remained laced with a sadness that I loathed myself for creating. On top of this, I knew he was worried about me, however useless it may have been to fret over. I could see the tightening of his jaw as he wiggled his hands beneath my back, bringing his arms around my torso, and squeezing me.
"You don't seem too bothered by it,"
he murmured into my skin, peeking up at me through his lashes. I used my fingers to push his hair from his forehead, exposing his eyes to me as I reasoned, "You'll only be 22 steps away." His lips curled up into a tight smirk against my skin, and he raised an eyebrow.
"So you've counted the steps to the guest room?"
he asked, his warm breath tickling my skin. At my nod of admission, he chuckled silently.
"Maybe we should get walkie-talkies, or some shit,"
he joked, eyes flashing as his brows raised. I rolled my eyes and weaved my fingers through his hair, shoving down the inkling of anxiety that rose in my chest as I dismissed dryly, "I think we'll survive." Secretly, I couldn't really think about it. I didn't want to show him my hesitance or nervousness over the coming experiment. He'd been with me during every step up until now, and I couldn't bear the thought of disappointing anyone. I had to do it. I could do it. I just had to push back the fear, and stop dwelling on it, and I'd be fine. I had to be fine. His chuckles abruptly ceased, and he was merely gazing back at me, intense, green eyes boring into mine as he swallowed, and finally lifted himself. He ran his fingers through his hair, and looked away, muttering,
"Right."
Exactly 1 week later, I awoke panting, clutching at the blankets in my fists, as my eyes sprang open. I lurched up and whipped my head around me, trembling and sweating as I searched the darkness. The room filled with my erratic breaths, loud and echoing off the bare, white walls as my heart thrashed wildly in my chest. Immediately, my feet itched to move my body from the room, but there was the obstacle of a space beneath the bed, and, suddenly, I had visions of hands grabbing ankles. That fleeting vision terrified me far more than it should. I was a fucking adult, not a frightened little child. I closed my eyes and tried to steady my pulse, imagining myself in the grassy expanse of the sunny meadow beyond the river. I tried visualizing the breeze, and Edward's arms around my waist, holding me safe and sound. He'd whisper in my ear and play with my hair and smile against my neck. The vision of this calmed me enough so that I could open my eyes. After my chest had regained a steadier rhythm, I laid back down stiffly, turning on my side. I stared at the wall blankly, bunching the sheet as I curled it beneath my chin. The shadows from the trees beyond the balcony door filtered through the sheer curtains and painted the walls with long, branching veins, climbing to the ceiling and reaching for the light fixture. The moon beyond the clouds bathed everything in blue, and I shivered, pulling the blankets higher. My eyes flitted to the closet, and I swallowed, watching the knob anxiously. 5 months ago, when I'd very first allowed Edward to coax me inside, the feeling of entering it had made me feel proud and empowered, but now it made me shudder to think I'd been in that one little space. Everyone had been so excited that evening, a far cry from the somber mood of the house on this particular night, before we'd all gone to bed. Edward had been helping me inside since then, once a day for the mere purpose of acquiring and depositing clothing. I could hear the wind sweeping through the lawns outside, blowing the remnants of the leaves from the winter through the yard with an eerie howl. The suggestion of Carmen's was insane, and she had no idea what she'd been asking at the time. Looking down, the bracelet that Carlisle had given me for Christmas reflected the blue hue of the room, and illuminated my pillow in a soft glow. The embossed, Cullen family crest was set in silver, attached to a simple, leather band that was fastened comfortably. He'd given Alice a necklace silver with gemstones, and far flashier than mine. I allowed the memory of her face on that day to soothe my anxiety, closing my eyes with a shaky sigh. Alice had never known her father, had seen various father-daughter functions throughout her years in school, and surely felt emptiness when Rosalie and Mr. Hale attended without her. She'd never confided this sadness to me, but that day, I'd known for sure that it had always existed. She'd thrown her arms around Carlisle's neck, burying her face into his shoulder, and hiding her tears. She hated being seen as emotional. Everyone had been particularly surprised by her reaction, Carlisle's eyes wide and fretful as he sought Esme's watery, rueful gaze. Cheesy bitches. Edward had told me about Carlisle's nervousness about giving us each one. Before I'd even had a chance to open the gift, Edward had begged,
"It means a whole fucking lot to him, okay? If it makes you feel weird wearing it, then just smile, and hide it away somewhere."
Edward had feared we wouldn't understand its meaning, or that we would feel as though Carlisle was making an attempt to replace our fathers. Well, I, for one, was perfectly pleased with being a part of Carlisle's family. Had never known my real father, and had already considered Carlisle my own anyway. Free jewelry that wasn't all ornate and flashy and gross was just a bonus. A distant scratching broke me from my musing, and I stiffened, my legs pulling farther into my chest, as my eyes wandered the darkened room. The bathroom door stood ajar, Edward's towel peeking out from where he'd left it 4 hours ago. My breathing transformed into shallow gusts as my eyes searched the darkness, the silence of the room heavy and suffocating. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt as though someone was definitely watching me. It was stupid and totally irrational, I realized this. There was no way anyone could get into the house with Carlisle's extravagant security system. He'd even upgraded it a week prior for this specific purpose. He knew I'd be up here, in this dark room, all alone, and he and me were trying to make this easier on me. And Edward. I tried to imagine him in the room, just right down the hall. He was nearby, and this should have made me feel a modicum of peace, but it didn't. I couldn't feel his proximity, or see his face, or hear his breaths. There was nothing tangible enough to soothe me. It was torture knowing that he was so close, yet so far. All I had to do was open my mouth, and produce the loudest, most blood-curdling scream I could manage, and I knew I'd have a room full of people standing before me, Edward among them. In my dreams, my screams were silent, my throat producing no sound, no matter how hard I tried to cry out. I knew this wouldn't be the case now, and yet my throat felt dry and parched, and my confidence wavered. What if I couldn't scream? I panicked. I supposed from my state of total alertness, that the sleeping MEDs that I'd taken before bed to knock me out had mostly worn off, even though my limbs still felt heavy and slow. Without them, I wasn't confident that it would have been possible to even fall asleep like this in the first place. Every inch of the room was black and blue, and it made me remember my old room next door. I didn't like this memory one bit. It put me impossibly more on edge, my body rigid under the covers. I feared if I moved, I'd ruin the whole night with my ridiculous, stupid fears by bolting from the room. I imagined Carlisle's face when he realized that I'd failed this test, so patient and understanding, yet inevitably disappointed. I imagined me and Carmen and Alice, and, most of all, Edward. Everyone was counting on me, and even though succeeding in this one task actually meant very little to me, when compared to the notion of giving in, my family was a different story. This was important to them. This was tangible progress, even more monumental than my being inside the closet that day. So why couldn't I focus on anything but the feel of the carpet beneath my feet, when I finally fled? Of course I had a choice. I always had a choice. It was weighing which choice was best for all invested parties. That was impossible. It was learning to be selfless and strong, and facing that fear of being alone in the darkness, that was so difficult. But I didn't have to be alone, and who given the choice would ever choose it while they lay in bed frightened and tense and so terrified of moving that their muscles began aching? It was utter madness, I decided, rolling onto my back, and staring at the empty, cold space next to me. This was how I'd felt when Edward was halfway across the country, completely lost to me. I would have given anything, then would have likely sold my soul and sworn myself to the devil had I been offered the opportunity to have him next to me. But Edward was no longer hundreds of miles away and untouchable. 22 steps. 22 steps and I'd be at his door. It was at that moment that I heard another light scratch, and my head snapped in the direction of the window, a lone branch tapping against the siding of the house. My neck was still damp from sweat, tears dried on my cheeks, as my eyes flitted wildly about the room and peered into black crevices and corners. Swallowing loudly, I threw the covers off my body, and sprang up once again, grasping the sheets as my eyes fixed on the door to the hallway. 22 steps. That was all it would take to be in his arms, safe and content and peaceful. My chest constricted the longer I sat motionless on the mattress, and felt the darkness of the room surrounding me, drawing in from the corners of the walls and pressing ever closer. I couldn't shake that feeling of eyes on my form, watching me as my breaths began emerging in sharp puffs through my flared nostrils. My pulse quickened, and my hands were clammy, cold, and damp, and I simply couldn't fathom remaining one moment longer. Succeeding suddenly seemed so pointless. I peeked over the mattress and fearfully searched the sliver of black beneath the bed. And then I leaped, my feet flying across the floor, as my heart raced. I began counting steps as I approached the door, 5 steps less than it might have been, had I not been so impatient to leave the room. Opening the door wasn't nearly as comforting as I'd